Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. Thank you for joining us tonight as we continue to celebrate the book, The Best We Could Do. This is our second highlighted program of the series. Our next one will be on November 17th with Dr. Jason Chang, and our first one you can find on our YouTube channel. Tonight's program, we welcome Chris George. He is the Executive Director of Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services. I'm going to turn it over to you, Chris.
Thanks. So, hello, everyone. What I thought I would do tonight is talk about the U.S. government refugee resettlement program, and then talk about how things have changed dramatically over the past few months because of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan and the challenges that we're all facing now resettling all of these Afghan refugees. And then I'll talk about what you can do and what other people can do to help alleviate the crisis. So, and then I'll leave time for some questions. Does that sound okay? Okay, great. So let's begin at the beginning. Which is what is a refugee. And if you're not entirely clear, you're excused because the word has been used in a very broad way and incorrectly over the years. But the international law definition of a refugee is a person who has fled his or her home country because of persecution. So those are the two sort of key elements of the definition. They have fled their home country, they've crossed an international border. Why? Because of persecution. Persecution because of their race, their religion, their nationality, membership in a particular social group, or their political opinion. And sadly, there are about 26 million refugees in the world today. Compare that to the population of Connecticut, 3.3 million, 26 million refugees in the world today. So what happens to refugees when they flee their home country? Well, they find relative safety in the country they have fled to. So if we take as an example, Syrian refugees, and Syrians are the one of the largest nationalities of refugees, probably about 3-4 million Syrian refugees. They have fled to Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and they will wait in refugee camps. And they'll wait and wait and wait for 5, 10, 15 years. Waiting for what? Well, waiting perhaps for an opportunity to go home for whatever drove them out to come to an end, the persecution, and they can go back home. Some refugees might be able to integrate into the country that they have fled to. So what that might look like is Syrians finding that they have a distant uncle in Jordan and they can get legal status in Jordan and have a life. And then the third durable solution for a refugees crisis, if returning home is the first, integrating into the country they fled to is the second. The third is resettlement, and that's what I'm involved in. Resettlement, and the way that works is that governments from all over the world will send representatives to refugee camps and other areas where there are refugees and interview refugees and run them through a security vetting process and then invite them to their countries. The US government historically has had the largest refugee resettlement program in the world. Typically, we invite more refugees to the United States than all of the governments with refugee resettlement programs put together. And that number is about 85,000. And in fact, in 2016, the United States, partly in response to the Syrian crisis, invited 85,000 refugees to the United States. So 2016, it was 85,000. And then the previous administration slashed the refugee resettlement program down to about 12,000 last year. And now we're trying to get it back up. So how does it work? I mean, how are refugees selected? So again, members of the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security will usually go overseas and interview refugees and then run them through a security vetting process. And the security vetting process is pretty rigorous. The Department of Homeland Security will ask refugees a lot of questions. There'll be long interviews. They'll collect their fingerprints, all kinds of information, addresses, phone numbers, names of friends, names of relatives. And all of this is run through databases, terrorist watch lists, criminal databases, the CIA, the FBI, all of our national intelligence agencies are involved. It's a long, rigorous, sometimes even a re-traumatizing process to interview people, because you're asking them, how were you persecuted? And it's not the kind of thing that people like to recall. So refugees, once they make it through that vetting process, are then asked to, there's also a health screening process. And then once they get through security vetting process, the health screening process, then they're asked, hey, do you have a friend or relative somewhere in the United States who could help resettle you? So if Sarah, for example, is a refugee from Syria, and we ask her that question, she says, oh yes, I have an Uncle Ahmed in Detroit. Then Sarah and her family would probably go to Detroit. But if she doesn't have a relative anywhere who is interested in helping to resettle her, then she will probably just be arbitrarily assigned to any state. And while she's packing her bags and getting ready to come, we get an email, and the email says, family of 5 from Syria, wherever, is coming in 2 or 3 weeks. So my staff springs into action, and they have to find an apartment for Sarah and her family. And it's not always easy negotiating with landlords to get apartments for refugees. I don't know if any of you are landlords, but if I were to call you up and say, hey, I'm interested in that 2-bedroom apartment on State Street, and you might say, well, who is it for? Is it for you or is it for somebody else? And I say, well, it's for a refugee. And the landlord will say, refugee, and I'll have to explain what a refugee is. And they'll say, well, do they have a credit history? Well, not exactly. They have an amazing history, but they don't really have a credit history. Okay, well, do they have evidence of income? I say, well, no, they don't have jobs yet, but we're going to make sure they get a job. And then the landlord might say, well, can I at least meet them? I'm sorry, they're not here yet. So, we ask a lot of landlords, but we do promise to co-sign the lease. So we'll get the apartment, we'll set it up with donated furniture. And if any of you have donated furniture, I'll thank you now. Thank you very much. We do buy one item that is brand new, and that is mattresses. We don't use used mattresses, but we'll set up the apartment. We'll stock the kitchen with about 3 or 4 days worth of food. And then, oh, this is my favorite part. We find someone who can cook a culturally appropriate hot meal to serve the family soon after they arrive. And that is actually a federal government requirement. Maybe the best federal government requirement of all times, that within 2 hours of a refugee's arrival, they must be served a culturally appropriate hot meal. So we get all this ready, and the family will, fly from Amman, Jordan, or wherever. Oh, by the way, they take out loans to cover their airfare, which might surprise you. I know it surprised me when I first learned about it back in 2005 when I started this work. The US government does not pay for refugees' airfare to come here, which is a little weird because most refugees have no money. They're deep into debt. But nevertheless, the US government policy is refugees will take out loans to cover their airfare. So they have to sign promissory notes to repay the loan. They fly to JFK, usually. They arrive there. Someone from the UN will meet them. They'll get into a car. They'll come up 95, and they'll arrive often late at night at the IRIS office. And our case manager will meet them. And if they don't speak, if our case manager doesn't speak the language, there'll be an interpreter there. So in the case of Sarah coming from Syria, we would need an Arabic interpreter. And then we take them to their apartment. They have a good night's sleep. They have that culturally appropriate hot meal, which always tastes delicious. They have a good night's sleep. And then the next day, we bring them to the office, sit them down, and we go over the program. First things first. And by the way, this is happening all over the United States now. Refugees are arriving as I speak somewhere in the United States. They're eating culturally appropriate hot meals somewhere, maybe in Louisville, Kentucky, or in Lewiston, Maine. They're having a good night's sleep. So it's going on all over the country, mostly with Afghan refugees, and we'll talk about them. But the day after the refugees have arrived, usually 1 or 2 days after, we'll bring them into the office and we'll go over the program. And we'll say, okay, the first thing we're going to do is take care of your health needs. And that can be done usually in partnership with Yale New Haven Hospital. But if refugees are resettled in the Hartford area, it'll be Hartford Hospital. And once we've taken care of your health needs, we're going to enroll your kids in school. After that, we'll enroll the adults in English language classes, and we're going to help you get a job. And we got to do all of this as quickly as we can because we really don't get that much funding from the federal government. You have to hit the ground running. This is a tough self-help program. But before you know it, the kids are learning English well, even winning academic awards in their schools. Parents are learning English at least well enough to make it through a job interview. They're getting jobs. I mean, they are usually minimum wage or a little bit above minimum wage. And before you know it, they're pretty much self-sufficient and beginning to integrate into the community. So it's really a remarkable program. And what's strange about refugee resettlement in the United States is that a lot of people really don't know much about it. The work is done by nonprofit groups. IRIS is one of 2 refugee resettlement agencies in Connecticut. There used to be 3. There used to be Catholic Charities based in Hartford. We are based in New Haven, and then there's another refugee agency, SIRI, that's in Bridgeport. But across the country, there are about 210 refugee resettlement agencies. And we're the ones who find the apartments, enroll the kids in school, connect them to healthcare, help them learn English, help them get jobs. Those are the basic tasks, the services. And over the past 40 years, which is about how long this structure has existed, we've done a pretty good job of providing services to refugees. But we have done a poor job, and I'm talking about all of the refugee resettlement agencies in the country, and I'm generalizing. We've done a poor job of educating Americans about refugees and engaging Americans in the process of resettling refugees. We've pretty much monopolized the work with our staff, a few volunteers. We've never really opened up the program until recently here in Connecticut. Iris has done it, but a lot of refugee agencies are content to just kind of work under the radar, keep a low profile. And the problem with that is when you need public support for refugee resettlement or political support for refugee resettlement in this country, and you ask Americans for that support, well, if they don't know anything about it, how are they going to support it? So our philosophy here, Iris's philosophy in Connecticut, is to engage as many people in this process, help them form groups of volunteers, and train these groups of volunteers so that they can welcome a refugee family to their community and do all of the things that my staff does. So most of the refugee resettlement agencies in the country will resettle refugees the way I described it, staff doing most of the work. But we developed a program, an approach here in Connecticut back in 2015, where we call it community-based resettlement or community co-sponsorship. And we will organize and train groups of volunteers and place refugee families with them. And those volunteers will do just about everything. And, you know, I know that many of my colleagues who work in refugee resettlement around the country, they don't use this approach, partly because, and I don't want to offend anyone if you're a volunteer in a refugee resettlement group, but many of my colleagues feel they just can't trust volunteers to do a good job, that this work is too specialized. Well, resettling refugees is hard work, but volunteers can do it. Let's look at it. Finding an apartment. I bet all of the people on this Zoom call, on this Zoom meeting right now, have found apartments, furnished apartments. You guys know how to furnish apartments. Connect people to healthcare. I think you have probably had some experience doing that. Enrolling kids in school. My gosh, you guys could probably do that with your eyes closed. You've done it so often. Help somebody get a job. I mean, these are basic skills that, you know, anyone over 50 or 60 has probably done several times. So these are things that volunteers have experience doing. And all it takes is a little bit of training, a little bit of cross-cultural orientation, and they can do a great job. And again, the main reason why I promote this model of refugee resettlement using community groups is because it builds public support. But there is another reason now, and we'll talk about that. So we had pretty much decided at IRIS that we were going to welcome about 400 refugees this year from Syria, Iraq, the Congo, maybe some from Afghanistan. This was back over the summer. But then the Taliban took over Afghanistan, and it created a humanitarian crisis. Every Afghan who had anything to do with the US government during its 20 years of occupation in Afghanistan, whether they were interpreters or truck drivers, or maybe they ran the laundry service at the Marine base in Kandahar, or they were mechanics or bookkeepers, anyone who had any relationship with the US government while it was there for 20 years immediately felt in danger. And they and their families wanted to get out. And many of them did make it through that gauntlet around the Kabul airport and got into planes and came out. In fact, more than 100,000 are either in the United States or will soon arrive in the United States. So 100,000 Afghan refugees, call them refugees, even though they're not quite at refugee status. They still need a little more processing. And 100,000 are going to be resettled in the United States. So they're on military bases now, and the military bases are fine for short-term stays. They're mostly tents, but people can't stay on these bases forever. And many of them have been on these military bases in Texas and Wisconsin, New Jersey for 2 months. So the State Department asked the refugee resettlement organizations, hey, you guys, we need you to resettle these Afghans so we can get them off the military bases. How many can you resettle over the next 4 months? And the refugee resettlement groups huddled and debated and came back with a number of 60,000. Well, if refugee agencies can only resettle 60,000, but there are 100,000 that need resettlement, there's a gap there of about 40,000. And what are we going to do with those 40,000? Well, I've already given you the answer in things that I've already said, which is community-based resettlement. If refugee resettlement agencies with their staff only have the capacity to resettle 60,000, then volunteers, community groups, churches, synagogues, book clubs, Rotary clubs, universities, colleges, they need to step forward, and many of them, are eager to help out and get some training and resettle, welcome to their community, a refugee family. This is happening all over Connecticut now. We have about 35 community groups. Many of them resettled Syrian refugees in 2016. They have re-upped, and new groups have also formed. And they basically said, our hearts go out to these refugees from Afghanistan. We feel partly responsible. We want to do something. And there are all sorts of things people can do write checks, donate furniture, donate winter clothing, but the ultimate assistance that can be provided now is assistance that gets people off of military bases. And that means forming a community group. So, I've been the executive director of IRIS for 16 years. We're a nonprofit, very, very nonprofit. And for the first time in my career at IRIS, I'm telling people, don't write a check, form a community group. That is the best way you can help. And of course, if you just don't have the means to volunteer and form a group, financial assistance is of course welcome. But forming a community group and getting a little bit of training from us, and then welcoming a family is the only way we're going to get people off of these military bases before the weather turns and they really begin to suffer. So that's where we are now. And as I said, there are groups all over the state that have sprung up. During my first 10 years at IRIS, maybe 1 or 2 groups per year would knock on my door and say, hey, we want to be a community co-sponsor. We want to welcome a refugee family to our neighborhood. 1 or 2 groups per year. In 2016, 50 groups stepped forward. And why? Well, they had this kind of memory of this old historic way of resettling refugees. And they wanted to revive it. So it was really a popular demand from the public, pounding on our doors saying, IRIS, we want to co-sponsor refugee families. Now, if they had knocked on the door of another refugee agency, they might have said, sorry, we don't use that model. Which is unfortunate, because every refugee agency should be using this model. I mean, it's like asking a football coach if they pass the ball and they say, sorry, we don't use the forward pass in our game plan. We just run it, which is ridiculous. A refugee resettlement agency should always be working with community groups as much as they possibly can. And again, to build public support, and then now to increase capacity. So I mentioned earlier that we told the State Department that we would resettle about 400 refugees this year, fiscal year 22. Because of the Afghan crisis, we have had to jump up to probably over 700. And the only way we can welcome 700 refugees to Connecticut is because we have the support of community groups. And that is the way we're going to get out of the crisis. So I can stop there and see if there are any questions. And